Michael Ungar, PhD, is a family therapist and professor of social work at Dalhousie University, where he holds a Canada Research Chair in Child, Family, and Community Resilience. His research on resilience around the world and across cultures has made him the #1 ranked social work scholar with numerous educational institutions, government agencies, and not-for-profits, relying on his research and clinical work to guide their approaches to nurturing the resilience of children and adults. He is the author of more than 250 scholarly papers and 18 books for mental health professionals, educators, researchers, caregivers, employers, including his most recent works, The Limits of Resilience: When to Persevere, When to Change, and When to Quit, and an edited volume, Multisystemic Resilience, Adaptation and Transformation in Contexts of Change, published open access by Oxford University Press. Dr. Ungar has received numerous awards for his scholarship and contributions to his community, including the Canadian Association of Social Workers National Distinguished Service Award, and has been named a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His blog, Nurturing Resilience, can be read on Psychology Today's website. Welcome, Dr. Ungar.
Thanks very much, Sandeep and Christy. Wonderful to have this opportunity to chat with you.
We would love to start by asking you about the word resilience and what it means to you. We recognize our listeners are parents and educators, and they may have varying understanding of the word resilience. So what does resilience mean, and why is it so important for our youth?
That's a great question. What we're basically evolving as a field of people looking at this concept of resilience. We used to talk about the simple idea of people bouncing back from adversity. And, that idea has kind of gone a little bit out of fashion because it puts so much responsibility on the individual to, do the bouncing. So much more now when we're talking about resilience, and whether we're talking about after a wildfire, or we're talking about after a tragedy at school, or maybe the death of a loved one, these kinds of things, we seem to be now understanding resilience as this process whereby not only do you have these internal qualities that get expressed, these traits that are possible to use for you to do well, but it's also about whether or not the world around you gives you the resources that you need to do really well is in addition to that. So I often talk about, the best way I know now to talk about resilience is it requires us to be rugged individuals, to show mindfulness and self-regulation and capacity to grow and learn. But it's also about the resources outside of us that make it possible for us to become our best selves. And the reason I really like that double-sided coin to talking about resilience is it takes away that kind of awful taint where it used to be, if you weren't resilient or, you were supposed to show resilience through everything. And sometimes the conversation seemed to center on the child or the parent or maybe the school or the educator, and not enough about whether or not they had around them the kinds of supports that they also needed to thrive.
I love that. I think even, in my own life, if I think about the hardest things I've been through, if you switch that definition from an individual process to a collective one, we can all relate that it's the people around us and supports we have that help us through. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
And if you think about it, that's what implicates educators as well. Well, not just the teaching staff at a school, but if you think about it, it's the support staff, it's the mental health staff, it's the special educators, it's even the front office staff, it's the custodians, it's literally you're creating this environment rich in opportunities for children to connect, to feel valued, to express themselves, and to bring out their best selves. And, just to say, somehow it's all inside the child, I think misses the point of that we have this tremendous influence over the ability of children to overcome adversity.
And it's so true, because when I think about what a lot of parents say, and sometimes we hear teachers say this also, is children are born with a certain level of grit. And, you see these fads, I guess you would say, like these tests that they do where you have like a bowl of marshmallows or candy, right? And as a precursor to how much resilience or grit that a child may have. And so in reading your book, it was really interesting to see and read about the resources that are needed. So when we think about our school system and the resources that we have, what can educators do to make sure that we have what children need? Like, what are the supports that you think are most important in a school system for kids who are struggling emotionally?
That's exactly the direction to go. If I can just sort of sow the seed into this conversation that it's really about matching, right? It's not just about flooding a child with all kinds of resources that are meaningless to them. It's about matching them. I'll even bring you back to, there's that very famous experiment, and many of us have seen it on the YouTube video of I think it's like a 4-year-old being given a marshmallow in a room by themselves and then being told, oh, well, if you don't eat the marshmallow, I'm going to come back in, is it 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever. I'm going to give you a second marshmallow. So you have 2 marshmallows if you can wait this out. And there's some idea of, in fact, there's been a lot of problems with the science of this, but let's just take it on face value for a second. What bothers me as a resilience scientist is that nobody asked the child, so tell me a little bit about your family. Are you in a family of 4 children, 6 children, 8 children? Are you living in poverty or wealth? When was the last time you actually got to eat a marshmallow? Yeah. Now, if you grew up at a dinner table, maybe generations ago, where there were 12 kids and very little food, and that marshmallow was put down on that table, you did not wait, because it was a survival strategy to dig in and grab that marshmallow, because you knew that no matter what someone tells you, there was unlikely your bigger brother or bigger sister was going to take that marshmallow from you, even if you got a second one. In other words, that there's always this kind of contextual specificity to what a child needs. But in the work I do, both clinically and my research, you do see repeating themes. We know that children do better when they have structure, routines in their lives. It's why after a natural disaster, it's very common for schools to be offered to a child as one of the very first mental health interventions. After all, you get a child back into the routine. You give them a sense of their life is back to normal. They have you almost sow in them a future orientation. You say, guess what? Your life is getting back to how it should be. Your education is not sort of, completely ended. You have a future. And the message of optimism doesn't come from asking the child to just, be reflective. It comes because we give the child a world which is much more predictable. So, if you give structure, and of course there's always that other one which goes hand in hand, which is consequences. The idea that, and in my work, it's not about punishment. It's very much about giving children the opportunity to fix their own mistakes. So they've done something where they've hurt another child, either with their words or deeds. Then, of course, the challenge is the consequences, how, they can enter that relationship again as soon as they figure out a strategy to make the other child feel safe, or the school feel safe, or whatever it is. Too often we arbitrarily give children consequences. So go to your room, we take your cell phone, I don't know, if we do whatever. And there's no connection necessarily, or no opportunity for the child to fix their own mistakes. And the reason I'm really hooked on that is because when I go around the world studying children in the most sort of extreme environments, and what I see in their lives is, patterns of resilience and coping. One of the things I often see in those lives is someone is saying to them, there's real consequences to your actions. We need you to do something, whether you're 5 years old or 15 or 25. And in a sense, we need you to step up. And it's those expectations that sometimes, if they're age appropriate, if they're reasonable, and they're resourced, so that you're not giving someone a task that they couldn't possibly achieve, then generally speaking, you get a more robust, rugged individual who's able to take on the next challenge. Routines and consequences are obviously where I start. And then there's kind of a bunch of others, things like obviously having a caregiver that you're connected to. If that caregiver is overwhelmed, I often talk about what are all the other relationships that are important in your life, and how do we as parents, indeed, how do we help our child become part of a matrix of relationships in their community. The funny example I sometimes give is, if you're I live on the East Coast of Canada, so I call ourselves casserole people. If someone down the street breaks their hip or something, an older person, everyone brings casseroles over to them to feed them. But I always say, well, why would I as the adult bring the casserole? If I have a 10-year-old child, then why don't I send my 10-year-old with the casserole? And then my 10-year-old is going to roll their eyes. Oh, I don't want to go and talk to Mr. Smith. He's an old crotchety old whatever, and he's going to talk to me he's going to keep me there for an hour and ask me about my hockey, and then he's going to ask me, he's going to tell me about his hockey when he was in the 90s. Oh, I don't want to do this. And of course you say to them, you're doing it because, I want you to be part of this community. I want you to feel valued. And if the child actually helped make the casserole, even better. So this idea of sewing in relationships, but then that also gives us powerful identities, maybe a sense of control, a little bit of decision-making power. You could add to that things like a little bit of social justice, just feeling like you're treated fairly in your community or in your family, in your school. You Add to that some, basic safety and supports and those kinds of things. And very quickly, you have this sort of short list of things that interact and they work together in a child's life and if you notice, what's exciting about doing this particular podcast is, of course, is that these things are all within the control or all within the influence of teachers. Without any extra money, without any extra stuff. This is all part and parcel of what good educators tend to do for their students.
I think the important thing there that you said is consequence. And a lot of times we talk about natural consequences because natural consequences are those that are fair and make sense in the situation. And I like the term that you used of matching, how it's different for every child.
And it should be. I know it takes a bit of work sometimes,
Yeah.
but what takes a lot of work is constantly managing misbehavior, or when the pattern is repetitive in a classroom and then so much of the energy of the educator goes into managing into behavior management rather than educating, which of course is what people actually want to do. So sometimes spending that extra few minutes with, taking that opportunity to think, okay, what exactly does this child need? And can I structure an experience for them right now so that they fix their own mistakes so that maybe then they won't continuously repeat the same thing over and over and over again. I don't want to go too much down the rabbit hole of this, but it's like basically the better the match, the better the child sees that I made a mistake. I don't know, I broke something, I lost something, I damaged someone, I made someone else unhappy. I'm always into actions speak louder than words. I'm not much into these letters of apology, and I don't find, because I don't see an impact on the child. I've never met a kid that said, I wrote the letter and it really changed my life. What I see instead is a child that actually has to do something nice, like, maybe, I don't know what that would be, but something that actually says, I see the person I harmed, and maybe I need to actually make their life just a little bit better, a little more safe, a little bit happier. And when you get to that level, I think you're forming relationships. You're embedding a child back into their community.
And I think like that's a piece that's really hard when you are an educator, because we have students that sometimes don't see what harm that they've done, right? And they might be students who are 11 or 12, and it happens over and over. And I believe like that's a piece that we struggle with the most, that I have kids that will come to the office and trying to figure out like the root behavior. And okay, so letter of apology isn't going to work because I don't think it's sincere right now. But that's a piece where it's those external supports that we need with somebody in the community or with parents or other supports to get to the root or to help.
And I just love, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about, how much more empowered a child feels when they get to be part of the solution, when they can recognize where that harm might have taken place with the school or with other students. And when they're part of that solution, then they're able to return to the classroom strengthened instead of feeling less than after something's happened. I'm curious, how does someone become an expert in resiliency? How did your story evolve that this became something you were so passionate about?
That's a good question. Probably two different threads to that storyline. The first one was, as I began my professional career, I was really interested in working around themes of empowerment and young people's voice and in the field of mental health. And I began to ask young people how they were coping, and was surprised sometimes by the very children that I thought were not doing well would actually tell me stories about actually coping quite well, but in ways that maybe we weren't seeing. So their tantruming behaviors were actually getting them a sense of security in relationships that they were afraid were going to leave them, or joining a negative peer group was actually the only people that would ever accept them. Problematically with adolescents, early sexual activity would give them a powerful identity. In other words, by listening to some of these kids, I was thinking, these kids are coping in these really poorly resourced environments as best they possibly can. And the phrase I came up with at the time was sort of playing at being bad. They were literally playing at being bad to get what they need. That was sort of the one thread. But I think the reason I could see those patterns was because a little bit of my own story. I emancipated at age 16. I left home, really completely on my own from 16 onwards. And I had a lot of, internal resources. I was able to go to university. I was able to sort of get jobs. There was an economy that allowed me to do that. Tuition was very low. So I had a lot of sort of structural opportunities around me, not to mention my own sort of social location, who I am. There was a lot of advantages there that allowed me, but but it did kind of put the spidey sense a little bit, if I can use that, into appreciating that even when young people were under a lot of stress, there would be some that would still be doing very well. What wasn't well theorized was the mechanisms that actually made that possible. And if I might, when I started this all back in my own career down this path and my own PhD and stuff in the early 90s, most of the work on resilience was from psychologists, American psychologists, principally some British psychologists as well. And they were all very focused on like cognitions and attribution styles and locus of controls and all this other Psych 101 stuff that you're probably being exposed to. And not too many people we're thinking about, I don't know, contextual factors, relationships, jobs, opportunities, how much money was in the home, sporting activities, recreation, the quality of the environment, bullying, all these other things that came surprisingly later in the conversations. And so I think maybe as a social work professor, by training, I was just a little more tuned into the contextual storyline. And then my work took me around the world looking at resilience across all kinds of different cultures and contexts. And suddenly you're kind of realizing, whoa, everything I thought I definitely knew about what made us survive and thrive is suddenly up for grabs. And maybe there are lots of other perspectives on exactly that bit of truth.
And Sandeep and I have both worked as school principals, and so I can relate to the parents that come in and see us at the schools. There seems to be almost conflicting needs of parents, and one is that you really want to protect your children and you want to make sure everything is safe and goes smoothly for them, and yet at the same time we want our children to be resilient. So what advice would you have for educators or parents that helps them find that balance where they can be a safety net for their children but also allowing them to face challenges?
That's a great direction to go with this conversation, because I did actually notice in my travels, I'd meet all these great resilient kids who were doing so well. And then I'd come back into Canada and I'd often meet parents really struggling to give their children, from positions of great stability and advantage, the very same things. And I called that the risk taker's advantage. And I found that we were holding back. And if I might, it wasn't just parents. It was also the institutions. It was schools. It was, there was a school in Ontario at one point that wouldn't let kids do cartwheels because they'd be inverted. The head would be below the, we went through a period of absolute insanity where we were literally relying on lawyers to raise our children or tell us how to raise our children. And of course, that's just not going to work. But one of the things I found kind of an effective way of engaging parents in this conversation is by shifting the focus from, I need to protect my child, which is good. And I don't ever challenge a parent to say what that protection should be. I don't know how dangerous your streets are. I don't know how much gang violence there is outside your door. I don't know whether or not there's an abusive person. I don't know. So I'm not going to challenge you on your protection stuff. But I am going to ask parents a series of questions about, so when you were growing up, what kinds of risks did you take? And what did you learn from those risks? And were those lessons helpful or unhelpful in your life? And then from that conversation, I usually jump to, okay, your own child, you're raising your own child. You don't want them to ride their bicycle on the street. You don't want them to go for sleepovers. You don't want them to do this, do that, whatever. Okay. But at the same time, you need to get them ready for life. So at what point, I often change the conversation from the protection to the readiness conversation. So when exactly are they going to be able to learn to cook, manage a budget, do their own laundry, have an expression of their own sexuality in a safe way? When are they going to be able to navigate their community, if that means public buses or bicycles or learning to drive? When are they going to be navigating the internet? When are they going to be, in other words, what are we doing to prepare them and ready them for when they will eventually launch and have the skill set required to actually cope without us? And see, for me, that's the shifting conversation. So when I hear about a parent who comes to an educator, my grade 8 child has just done something wrong at school, and I'm coming in to talk to that principal, and I'm going, okay, well, why? Kind of like, is that the right? Isn't this a wonderful teachable moment to say to the child, okay, what did you do? Well, I don't know, whatever. Well, it sounds like a wonderful moment for you to go and learn the skill set to talk to the principal and say, negotiate a resolution to this problem. Because ultimately, one day you'll be in a work site.
Yep.
Or in a long-term committed relationship. And I'm not going to inflict you on that person without some skill set to resolve crises, because I'm not going to do this for you. And it's like the shift in focus has to be to what are we trying to produce? I mean, it's a bit of a weird way of saying it, but what can we, in terms of, I want my child to be a competent, caring contributor to their community. And gosh darn, how do I get my kid there, not just protect it?
So, in schools nowadays, we see more and more often how parents want to remove discomfort from their child's life, like especially when it comes to social problems. Sometimes parents won't even wait 1 or 2 days for things to settle down a little bit. They want to solve the problem for their child. And we see this often reflected in absenteeism, where children won't come to school sometimes. It could be a factor because they're having some social problems and parents are stepping in. And a lot of times they make it worse because it might be a problem between 10-year-olds, a problem between 11-year-olds. Why do you think parents are so quick nowadays to remove this discomfort from their kids' lives?
So there's a couple of ways that I could approach that. In a more maybe benign way, I think what we've mistakenly understood what our children need. We in promoting a trauma-informed discourse, which was appropriate, I think we overstepped a little bit. We began to label normal events in children's lives as potentially traumatizing. And I use the word potentially traumatizing, which is based on a theory from George Bonanno in New York. And the idea is that any event, yeah, it could be traumatizing, but in most cases, they're not. But in trying to do something good, which was become more trauma informed, I think we went a little bit too far and we said that everything is trauma. And it's not. So a fight, memorably, these two kids were having a snowball. This one kid came in and complained that he'd been picked on, and there'd be a snowball fight on the very Canadian story, right? And they got thrown a snowball at him, and he was complaining that he's being bullied and everything else. And the parent got all in huff, and I was consulting on this, whatever. And I remember asking the parents, so let's just clarify this. Children are the same age, same sort of background, same ethnicity, same race, same whatever, same abilities. Yeah, they just don't really like each other. Yeah. And this other kid threw a snowball and hit my kid in the head. And I said, wow. And my first gut reaction was, well, it sounds like your kid just really sucks at snowball throwing. That's all. I mean, you can't quite say that, but you want to say that because the issue is not that kids should have, snowballs beamed at them, but like if it's not an icy snowball that's perfectly meant to harm, but just a silly snowball that's going to explode when it hits you, then maybe it is just an issue that the kids need to sort out and to understand that there are going to be people that don't like you, and maybe your strategy is you just stay away from that person on the playground, or you just agree to disagree, whatever, or you use a better strategy, you just have a friend around you all the time when in other words, these are 10-year-old problems that 10-year-olds can solve with minimal intervention. And you're right that when we intervene, we sort of up crime. There's a phrase in criminology called up criming, where you take a very modest event and you make it into something much bigger. And I wonder sometimes if we've been doing that, one, because we don't want our kids to ever feel discomfort, and we've misunderstood that discomfort is part of good psychosocial development, just like failure. Sorry, am I allowed to use the 4-letter F word?
Go for it.
That's the ultimate 4-letter
letters,
F word, right? You're allowed to say the word fail. So you get, if you can actually provide these opportunities for age-appropriate failure, that the child has an opportunity to fix their mistakes or resolve the situation in a reasonable way that's, again, developmentally appropriate and all that kind of stuff, then you tend to get that, well, what we're talking about, which is resilience. If I might, though, if I could stretch this a little bit, sometimes I think, though, we are not only talking about the child anymore. We're also talking about the parents' sometimes fragility. There's a bit of a theory about this. I got to say it sometimes resonates, is that, when you have parents are now defining themselves by their child.
Yeah.
For my child to have this insult against them,
Exactly.
it is an insult against me. And I want control of this, so I'm going to withdraw my child, and I'm going to storm the school, and I'm going to be really, in the face of the educators who are not doing their job, quote unquote. That's, whatever. There's a confusion there about, is it about you, the parent, or is it about your kid? And I often have to sort of tease that apart to say maybe this is triggering for the parent. Maybe their identity is caught up way too much with their child's success. And, and I often do this through storytelling and everything else, but it's like, try and back a parent away from wrapping themselves up. Somehow their success is tied up with their child's success. And once you're down that path, then there is, unfortunately, what I try and remind parents is that this pattern of overprotective parenting is, the science will tell you, is that your child has less likelihood of being successful. You are literally undermining their academic abilities and more likely to have a child with anxiety disorders by being overprotective. Reasonable protections, reasonable supervision, absolutely. all good. But when it's this obsessive kind of over the top or stepping in where you really aren't needed, then what you're actually likely to see is a child who's less likely to succeed in university or college, more likely to have anxiety disorders, more likely to be socially isolated, and less academically inclined. So I often say, beware of what you're trying to get. If your objective is, again, that competent, caring contributor to your community that's academically successful, maybe telling your 10-year-olds to just figure out a better strategy on how to deal with the kid who just threw a snowball at them is actually going to help them get to university.
And when you talk about that, it makes me really think about sports, like when kids are not making the top tier soccer team or the hockey team, parents get very, very upset, especially with sports. And you see the impact that it has on kids and their enjoyment and their anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess, again, there's a couple of different ways to approach that. One is that you want a child to try and occasionally experience some degree of failure because it's a motivator to learn maybe that sport wasn't the best fit. Maybe volleyball is not really the best sport for them. And maybe this is a door opener to something else that they'll enjoy more, whatever that is. Maybe it's e-games, or maybe it's, rowing, or something that's more of a individualized sport or something like that. I mean, I'm amazed that, we get so caught up in this one little item, often because, again, and sometimes the parents, I really want my child to play hockey or whatever it is. And then they lose sight of the fact that this is just one step in a growing process. And not to mention, I mean, it's so funny because, having raised 5 kids all in their 20s and early 30s now, and I think of all the times that we thought, oh, it's so important that they get that recital, so important they get on that AAA team. And they're not playing hockey; they're playing recreational hockey. One of them almost got into the QMJ, the sort of the next tier, and got drafted momentarily. And but I mean, like, he's happy. Not, it's kind of like we lose sight of where we all end up, right?
Yeah.
And my daughter, who showed great promise as a piano, and she still plays a little bit, but she's not at Carnegie Hall.
She's happy.
I don't even think she wants it to be. But anyways, so I think sometimes I'm always amazed when you talk to these parents and whatever who are so obsessed by this, and you talk to the kid and they go, "Oh, you lost and you didn't get on." You talk to them a day later and go, "Oh yeah, I have this great team. I'm in the B League, but I'm having a great time. Why? What's the problem?"
And they're getting more playing time, right?
They
Sometimes.
get more playing time, yeah, and there's less stress. Now, if the kid is really, there are children that really want to excel. They want to push, and that is their personality. If they don't get onto the AAA whatever, then maybe there's a different sport that they can pursue. If you're not going to make the AAA hockey team, have you tried squash, competitive squash as a kid? Some of this, I know it sounds weird, but some of the same skill sets, the hand-eye coordination, the reach, and a bunch of other things are actually transferable. We don't explore all the different options. Now, can I make one small caveat on this?
Of course.
And the caveat is that we're talking as if every child starts from the same position of advantage. That experience of failure could mean something very different to a child who has absolutely almost no opportunities. So I'm assuming, if you notice what I just did there, I went equivalencies. Oh, well, you're not going to play AAA hockey, so maybe parents can sign you up for a squash at the local sports center. I'm assuming you have the money to do both, or one of those. But what about a child in your school who has absolutely, if they don't get on that team for basketball after school, they are not going to ever do any sports?
Yeah.
Now, for me, that's a structural problem. That's not the child's problem. That's the structural problem of, if you have a very high-risk population of kids in your school district, is there a way of creating a more inclusive sporting program, perhaps at 2 levels or 2 tiers, so that some of those kids that are obviously not going to make that top tier, one, because they probably don't have the advantage of the time to put in and the coaching and all the other things, are you able to provide an environment where they don't have to experience that much failure? So I say failure is good. I use the F word again. Failure is good, but not for the child whose life is full of failure and stigma, and it shows up in, without a lunch, and whose clothing is never, the latest Adidas sneakers this year, and it was Nike last year. And, that kid doesn't need more failure. What they probably need is some success. And this is this conversation, almost like a ping pong game around resilience, right? It's not just about the child. And now it's on the other side of the net for the school to see what they can do to create an accommodating environment that child can play or something, or feel at least that rush of, I belong somewhere. And I think so sometimes people say, well, what's best for a child, sports or no sports? I say, well, tell me, should a child fail or not fail? I say, well, you haven't told me the most important criteria. What is the risk that child is under? What will that failure mean, and what would happen after that failure? to help that child grow. And if you've got lots of wraparound services and supports and opportunities, then maybe a little bit of failure is good. It reboots our lives and gives us new direction and teaches us quote unquote grit. But for the child who already has lots of grit, just surviving, figuring out how to cook a meal for their parent when they get home, or how to keep everything together emotionally, they don't really need a bit more failure.
Yeah.
That's such a good example for our educators and for Sandeep and I to listen to as, having that responsibility for our systems and how do we make sure we're looking at it through that collective lens of the impact that it might have on a student versus another. So I absolutely appreciate that example. My youngest is just he's graduating this year and he's off to move across Canada to Toronto to go to university.
Right.
And so I'm sure there's other parents that maybe it's whether they're going into kindergarten for the first time or maybe they're getting on a plane and relocating somewhere. What advice do you have for parents who want their children to thrive and be resilient?
Oh boy. I mean, I think those conversations, I mean, if I had to give the best advice, it would be the year before this transition that you're beginning to give them the skill sets, the social skills, the negotiating skills, the problem solving skills, the experiences of shopping for themselves and getting them all set up with the skill set, not just sometimes the financial things we think about, the courses we think about, but what about all the sort of the life skills that are going to be required so they don't live on Kraft Dinner and Uber Eats, when they actually get out there in terms of older kids. But it's the same as a child going from grade 6 to grade 7 or something in terms of if that's the transition year to junior high or whatever is happening. It's about preparation for the period before. So that's the best. Now, if suddenly you're here and that transition is about to happen, then of course it's a little bit about negotiating with the child to say, what exactly do you need? A more insecure child might just need you to check in a little bit more often, but you should not go live in residence. My own university has a rule that after 2 weeks, parents have to leave the residence.
Oh, wow.
There are universities with rules like
Yeah.
that because
Yeah.
parents would move in with their kids.
It's
And I think that this is about we are there to coach them into some of those skill sets. If it's the transition from, JK to kindergarten, grade 6 to grade 7 or whatever the transition year is, or if it's, moving into college, I really do think that our job as parents and as, maybe educators is to coach our children through those transitions. And then different children will need more or less help. Not all function at the same level. Some need more help choosing their courses in university, and some are just saying, I can do this on my own and I'm quite happy to make my own mistakes. So I always say that, I like to sort of be in a negotiation with my child based on their own skills and a little bit of their own history and their own way of solving. My child never gets out of bed until noon, and they go to university and they start choosing courses that start at 8:30 in the morning. A frank conversation with them might be in order. But that's coaching, right? That's bringing out the best, most rugged, best resource kid that we can help our children become, whether it's as a parent or indeed as a school system.
In your book, The Limits of Resilience, there's one thing we haven't touched upon is that you stress the idea that resilience isn't always about pushing through. Right? Sometimes as parents or educators, our kids are in a tough situation and we want them to push through. And you talked about there are prices for that type of resilience. If we're not careful, we pay with our health. Sometimes it's knowing about when to change or quit. How can parents and educators recognize those moments in a child's life?
Yeah, I think we've misunderstood that resilience is always positive. And there is a physiological cost to being excessively under stress for too long. There's lots of studies, and if you want to read a little bit more about it, it's in The Limits of Resilience. But the idea is that if we push too far, too long, too hard, and you see that sometimes with children, especially I've worked with some children who were elite athletes, and they were just pushed and pushed, and at some point they burn out. Like I'm talking 11 years old, that type of age. Or you see a child that's just the pace of the activities they're in, or the demands of a family that's in chaos, or another move, another community. They are very, children who just don't deal well with change or new social relationships. So that constant effort that we're asking of them to be resilient. Now, sometimes it's by necessity. The parent's job evaporates, they have to move again. I get that. But I think sometimes assuming that, well, our child did it, made that transition well once, he can do it again for the fourth time in 3 years, might be overestimating that resilience is not a once I have it, it's forever there and it grows and grows and grows. It can be expended. It can be the tank can empty a little bit, or if I continue too long, I break down. And the way you see that is, I always say, little people vote with their bodies. When they're very young and they don't want to be in the car seat, they arch backwards, right? And they throw things and they grab and they tantrum. When they're 14, it looks very different, but it's not, it's the same set of cues. It's moodiness, it's withdrawal, it's a lack of effort or obsessiveness, it's headaches, it's tummy aches, and suddenly, we might be thinking, well, you just got to make the kid toughen up a little bit, but maybe it's also about the environment. Maybe it's just too much at that particular time. So there's a dance here. And, again, if all those symptoms I just gave you and the child's not doing anything, they have no social relationships, no activities, then maybe that's a different conversation than the child who's in 4 different activities and studying for finals. And, then I think there's a little bit of understanding, putting into context what a child's experiencing. And then that becomes our job as the caregiver to maybe try and shape an environment that is better suited to the child's personality, if at all possible. There are some children that are going to love group assignments in the classroom, and there are others that are going to thrive on more individual work. And it's not that I wouldn't give a child who likes individual a group assignment, but I'm going to be cautious a little bit that if I give them too many social activities, they're going to become agitated, dysregulated, that type of thing. And that's my fault in a sense. I'm not giving enough flexibility here in what I'm offering. Now, it's hard as an educator to tailor everything, but maybe having a variety of different tasks within a curriculum is probably the solution. The groupie child has lots of groups, and the individual child still finds individual times as well. And somewhere in there, you're probably going to create the right environment for the most number of children and maybe help them get through.
Wow.
Thank you.
I'm just feeling so inspired by so much that you have shared with us today, because we know that most of our listeners on our podcast are parents or educators. Sandeep and I are both parents and educators. And I'm just thinking about how what you've shared with us not only helps me in how I would work with our students and having that kind of bird's eye viewpoint of looking at all of our schools and looking at our systems and how are our decisions impacting kids differently. But certainly as a parent, I'm taking so much away. And, as I thought about my youngest going away to university, I was thinking about what he needs. And you have taught me as a parent that it's a little bit about being aware of what I need to or what my husband needs, so that we don't become those helicopter parents moving into the dorm that you mentioned. So I promise you I won't be that parent, but I wanted to sincerely thank you for taking time to be with us on Leading Voices in Education, and thank you for sharing your knowledge about resilience.
Pleasure, Sandeep, Christy, real pleasure.